Hi everyone and welcome. This here is my mixed bin, is how I refer to it. It's got red wigglers, European night crawlers, and blue worms in it. It's 1 day shy of being 18 weeks old at this point. It's 125 days of age. It was a week ago when we last checked in on this bin to feed it, and at that time it had received its 13th feeding. So today, a week later, I believe it's due for another feeding. It'll be its 14th feeding, and I don't have a lot of food for this bin today, so we might be back in here again pretty soon. But I figured I'd, grab some stuff that I've got to give them and take care of getting them fed. So I'm going to get this bin up on the bench and we'll get to work. So here's the bin. It's got a few coverings on it. It's got various layers of paper working to keep the moisture in the system. In the past I had used plastic coverings a lot to keep moisture within the systems, but I've been trying to transition away from using it unless I feel that it's absolutely necessary. And, to me, brand new bins that have lots of fresh bedding in them, perhaps not a lot of castings yet, those seem like the types of systems where it is necessary to kind of help the bin a little bit in terms of helping it retain its moisture. But a bin like this that's pretty far along already has enough vermicompost mixed into it already that it really has no problem hanging on to its moisture all on its own, with just a little bit of help. So what I've got here is a whole bunch of leafy material spread out across the top. I usually go till maybe about day 100 in my bins. Then I'll stop adding the leaves, mainly because of those little sticks and stems that the leaves bring with them. Because I don't know how long it's going to take for these little sticks to all break down, but I don't want to end up with a bin full of almost ready to go finished castings and not be able to go to harvest because of a whole bunch of little sticks that still need to break down. So for me, a rule of thumb has often been lately to try to withhold slow composting materials from my older bins. In my newer bins, it's kind of an anything goes sort of an approach. But in a system like this one, I am going to be kind of selectively choosing the materials I put into the bin to try to use stuff that I feel pretty confident in that it's going to break down between now and the time I plan to harvest the system to get the castings out and relocate the worms. Now the feeding would have been applied right down the middle. So we're going to I guess we'll take a quick look-see to see how things in here are coming along. I'm just gradually pulling back stuff to see how long it takes before we actually begin encountering some worms. Finally starting to see a few here and there. I thought that if I would bump into some stuff like this, like a chunk of cardboard or paper or whatever, I might pile it up over here with a lot of these old leaves that are just sitting out on the surface. Because I'm thinking of starting to use some of these old leaves as the foundation for today's feeding to get some of that stuff submerged down low. Give it a chance at being broken down versus having it just sit out on the surface and get somewhat neglected and not get the attention it needs to break down. So right away I'm starting to see a little bit of a pile of worms hanging out down here, probably working down some sort of a yummy morsel of food that's right here. I don't know what's here, but we can try to figure it out. It looks like it's a mango seed. It's kind of sitting here open. I don't know if maybe some food might have been placed alongside of it or on top of it. This thing's pretty old. I don't know if it's really what's drawing them, but it could be. It's interesting. I'll take some of these old food chunks and position them on here to also make sure they end up back down in the feeding area. This is kind of a cool bin. I always find that the inhabitants of the bin always do seem to kind of mob together to zero in on some of the food items that were put in here last time. And I figure after a week, maybe we are going to find some worm balls, because a week is often enough time for the worms to put a pretty good dent into what they received, but maybe not polish it all off. So we're just going to kind of bump into them as sort of a work in progress, trying to break down the foods they got last time. So we'll do our best not to disturb their activity too much this is so weird too, like a definite worm ball. Not very large, but definitely a bunch of worms mobbing around something. And I might have just dislodged them from something, or I don't know what it is. Or were they here and they rolled down? I wasn't paying attention. It is possible that I already played with the same worm ball once previously. I think I did that in the last video too. I got really jazzed about a pile of worms that I encountered along the way and then set them aside, only to bump into that same pile again later to be wowed by, wow, another worm ball, which just turned out to be the same worm ball. So none of these are really massive, huge, impressive worm balls. They're just like kind of little fun, interesting little pockets of within the last feeding area that seem to be attracting good amounts of worms, and they're all over the place in here. I don't really remember what kind of foods were used the last time we fed in here, but they definitely seem to like whatever it was. Something tells me that there were grapes. Somehow I vaguely remember these worms getting maybe some carrots and some grapes. And usually when I feed grapes, I expect to find lots of leftovers of grapes, but I haven't bumped into any. So maybe I'm just mistaken when it comes to grapes. There are certain foods that sometimes surprise me in terms of the time it takes for them to get broken down by the worms. Stuff that you would kind of think that would go very quickly sometimes surprises you and takes a long time to get broken down. Some of the material right out here flanking the feeding area is a little bit dense. Maybe this would be a good time to try to break this stuff up a bit, and let's see if we've got sort of a similar thing on this edge too. Yeah, a little bit dense. A little bit dense, a little bit damp, and very heavily populated with worms. This bin probably could use some good aeration. You stumble on a big chunk of stuff that sticks together like this, makes you wonder why. And usually I would assume that it's got to do with perhaps excess moisture. So I'd rather have that stuff sort of break apart a little bit more loosely than that. Even though I'm not covering up with plastic, this system is definitely doing a good job hanging on to its moisture content. And for a little while longer, I would tend to want to keep it that way, I believe. Because the worms definitely like it. I think it helps with the softening of the foods that they're going to be consuming. And obviously that helps with the breakdown process. So let's prepare to feed. The stuff I've got for them, like I said, is not much. But I've got a tray here with some stuff in it. It's just the used coffee out of the coffee machine, a bag of vegetables that had been frozen for a while, but then my freezer went bad. It's been fixed since then, but this was one of the things that was sort of frozen and then thawed out, and I wanted to just discard it because I didn't really trust that it was still in good shape. But I've also got a couple soiled paper towels down here that we could use as bedding too. So I'm going to tear it up a little bit to help increase its surface area, and stick it right down there in the bottom of the feeding area. And then we could use some of this old stuff that seems like it's been getting neglected a little bit and drop it down in here too. And use that as the basis for our feeding today. And just drop the food right on top of there. I think last time I fed one of these chunks of frozen veggies, I needed to break it up using my pocket knife. I got a feeling that that's going to be the same story here today. I only removed this from the freezer a little while ago, so I think I'm going to need to help that apart into little chunks with my knife. So let's see if we could do this in a safe way so I don't stick my hand with my knife. I'm not sure of the moisture content of this stuff, but it does seem like it's kind of stuck in its own liquid. I assume that it was frozen, and then when it thawed, it might have released some of its moisture, and then when it froze again, it just sort of became a big block of ice. So this certainly wouldn't have been the way that it would have been sold in the store, I don't think, as a just big block of material. I assumed that it would flow a little bit better. Gosh, I didn't think it was going to be this tough. Maybe the one that I fed last time was just not as frozen and I was able to chip it apart more easily than this one. And it's not the end of the world if I just put it in one spot, but I do like to try to spread the food out a little bit, if possible. Oops. But if it's not possible, it's not the end of the world. I'm just going to see what I could do about getting this thing to break apart a little bit better. There we go. Almost feels like I need an axe or something to get through this stuff. All right, we'll give it another go. A couple more swipes at it, you know, but I don't want to go crazy and I don't want to slip and cut myself either, so we'll leave it at that. There'll be two little chunks out on each edge that are a little bit bigger than the rest. This is a rubber band. You know, it's funny because I remember previewing one of my videos in the past and noticing this rubber band, and just based on its color, it's pink, so it looks just like another worm, except for the fact that it doesn't move. So it's not going to break down, so it's coming out of the worm bin. And then maybe just a little bit more of this stuff that I'd like to see break down a little bit better, stuff that we scraped off the top surface. But before we close up shop here in the feeding area, let's drop in the coffee that they're getting as well. And since I've already got another coffee filter set aside from earlier, the one that was resting out here on the top to indicate where we fed, I'm just going to take this coffee filter and hack it up into little pieces, kind of like what we did with the paper towel before, and spread it around throughout the feeding area. A little compliment to the very nitrogen-rich food that they've just received, a little bit of carbon-based stuff too that they can nibble on for a little bit of variety. The last thing that I like to always add with my, not always, but most often, but it's certainly not a requirement, but it is occasionally good to include some grit with the feeding that you're giving your worms. And I've been pretty generous with this stuff because I got plenty of eggs, or at least egg shells, that I could use to make more. And this is a little chunk of leftover food from previous feedings. Something like this, a mango seed, or at least the outer husk of a mango seed, would normally take quite some time to break down, but it's getting there. But we'll put these little guys right back on top of it. This makes me wonder, what is it that they're so jazzed about in here? A little tiny worm ball. And they're not enjoying the bright lights, so let's not torment them any further. Let's start covering them up so they can get back to work on that husk of a mango seed. And then we'll just cover up the feeding area with some of this other stuff that we pulled together from the top surface. This bin is littered with all kinds of scraps of old bedding, chunks of uneaten food. This is like the piece of a cantaloupe rind. Not that there's much of it left. So there's all kinds of stuff littering this bin that the worms can nibble on. They don't need to come down into the feeding area to get food. There's food everywhere in this bin. And I got a feeling that that probably translates into there being worms pretty much all over the place in here as well. So why don't we, oh, look at that, another worm ball. A little one. I'm bringing it close to the camera lens just so it looks a little bit larger. A little optical illusion. But these worms are kind of cool because they do tend to mob together and share food items. It's a sort of behavior I don't really notice in my nightcrawler bins, in my red wiggler systems, and in my blue worm systems. And I believe it's the blue worms that we're seeing in here primarily, because I believe that they dominate the population in here. Those types of worms do seem to huddle around food items and mob it, as opposed to other types of worms which don't seem to do that. So it's always fun checking in on bins like this. There's more and more scraps as I just dig around pretty much anywhere I find scraps. Before I close up though, something else I've been doing lately is just checking the outer edges of my bins. Not only to see what kind of moisture content is out there, because since it is the furthest away from the feeding area, it is probably the area in the bin that's most subject to drying. And I just don't want to have any portion of my bins get so dry that there's going to be no worm activity there. And even though we're not seeing a lot of worm activity, there is a good amount of moisture, so I don't think there's any reason for concern out on this side. So I do like to aerate as well, as you noticed. So if nothing else, at least we're introducing a little bit of air down into this material by stirring it up a bit. And I'm going to check the other side as well. You know, after 14 feedings, I've got another system that's there's only one other system of mine that's older than this one, and it's a number of weeks older than this one is. And in that system I've already stopped feeding. It got 15 feedings before I stopped, and for the past couple weeks it's just been sort of foraging, which is what I refer to it as, which means the worms don't get anything fresh. They're kind of, you know, they're left to roam through the bin, you know, seek out leftover bits of food, of which there's plenty in this bin. So if at some point I were to switch over to kind of a foraging mode in here too, I think the worms would be quite all right for quite a while with all the leftovers that can be found throughout this material in this bin. And luckily, since I've been pretty generous with the bedding recently, it does seem like the material is pretty loose and flaky and mixed pretty heavily with scraps of various types of bedding throughout. All the little chunks of leaves that might be broken apart and kind of blending in with the castings, making them hard to see, are probably in great abundance as well. And there's also the stuff that sticks out a little bit more easily, the chunks of paper that are obviously still unprocessed bedding materials. Whether it's food or bedding, it all becomes castings in the end. It all becomes worm food. So I've got a feeling with a small feeding like this, we'll probably be back here in about another week again to feed, and then at that point it'll be its 15th feeding, and it'll also be nearing that age that I sometimes stop feeding and start transitioning a bin to foraging. So that could be in the cards for this bin very soon too. And as far as the moisture goes, you know, that's kind of a consideration for how to cover up. We'll put this piece of paper here to indicate where we last fed, which is something I like to do. And then these coverings seem to be doing a pretty good job. They stay a little bit dry, so the worms are not attacking it and treating it as food. And this is perhaps an extra layer, something you don't see so often. Sometimes I just go with those couple sheets of newspaper and then right on with the cardboard. It might be this extra piece of paper here, this paper bag, that's helping to keep the moisture level in here a little bit higher than I see in some of my other bins. And the worms definitely seem to like it, but if I want to see drying in here at some point soon, then I might consider removing some of these paper coverings. But for now, I'm leaving everything the way I found it, and we're going to put it back on the shelf to continue. So that's it for today's video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.